Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to talk about the security incident response communication, or PR, after a big security incident. We have the honor to invite Christopher Budd to chat with us today on his thoughts and experience in this area. He has helped many of the large firms on the crisis communication after some of the major security incidents. I've worked with Christopher on one of the previous projects where he helped major video conferencing company deal with some of the security incidents, helped save them a few times from a deep trouble. I'm very impressed with Chris' preparation for the security incident communication. So Christopher, can you tell us about yourself?
Thanks for having me. So again, I'm Christopher Budd. My kind of tagline that I've used for about 10+ years now is I take awful news and make it just bad. I started life in terms of security incident response at Microsoft. I was part of the Microsoft Security Response Center, the MSRC, for about 10 years. The average lifespan when I was there for folks was about 2 years. So I'm a bit of a glutton for punishment, or I have a lot of endurance. If you are familiar with Patch Tuesday, I helped build that way back in the day. You're welcome, because I know how much everyone loves that. But I helped build the security and privacy incident response processes at Microsoft. I was the global communications lead there for a few years at the end. Since then, I've worked for a handful of companies. I've done consulting, and like you said, Kyle, we worked together on a project. So I have been, living in the world of incident response for, literally since 2000, 2001. I used to joke that in a bad month at Microsoft, I would manage more incidents and crises in 1 month than your typical PR person would manage in their entire career.
Oh, I definitely will imagine.
Yeah. I also used to say when what I was working on was on the front page of MSNBC, I was having a bad day. Yeah. And then I upgraded it to say when what I was working on was the big picture on the front page of MSNBC, it was a really bad day.
Yeah, those must be the very interesting days. So I think there are some questions I'd like to get your thoughts on. Let's start with, in the event of the major security incident, such as the loss of millions of customer records or just serious vulnerabilities that are about to be disclosed in the next minute. What do you do in this situation? What do you do in the communication or PR from the PR point of view? And how do you prepare for something like this?
Sure. So there's about 3 questions in there. So let me take them kind of one at a time. So if it's going to happen in the next minute, like you said, my first piece of advice is, as the Hitchhiker's Guide says, don't panic. Really, so I have a background in technical security and communications. I also have a background in security and privacy. Typically people have specialization in any one of those. So I tend to bring kind of a broader point of view to these things. Taking the scenario that you've just outlined, or scenarios, really, so the first thing that you should do is establish if you're dealing with a security incident, a privacy incident, or both. And here's why: because security incidents and privacy incidents have different dynamics and follow different paths, primarily because when we're talking about privacy, there's a whole host of legal and regulatory issues that come up that you don't face in a classic pure security incident. So right out of the gate, taking the examples that you've got, you need to establish, is this a security incident where people are being hacked, denial of service, things like that? Or are we talking about data breach, data loss, in which case that becomes a privacy incident, which just opens up a whole other host of issues. The next thing is you want to differentiate, what you know and what you're saying. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is you can't say anything about an incident until you know what you're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the situation that we're talking about, absolutely the most important thing is to start assessing and triaging and getting your arms around the incident and understanding just what it is, what's going on, what do we know. Now, very typically in the early stages of an incident, the answers to those questions are going to basically be, we don't know, because these things tend to move fairly fast in the public sphere. They tend to move slower in the technical sphere. So, making a priority and differentiating the technical response and the communications response is actually really key. In the past, in things that I've worked on, we have actually bifurcated the process so that you have an engineering response team and you have a communications response team. Now there's liaison back and forth between the two, which would typically be me because I have a technical and a communications background. But breaking those out is absolutely critical, because there's a technical issue here that needs to be worked, and there's a communications issue that needs to be worked. Mm-hmm. They're going to follow different timelines. They're going to have different cadences. They're going to have different needs and requirements. Going back to what we were talking about, what you say over here is also, when we're talking about privacy incident, is also going to be dictated and governed by those same laws and regulations that I was talking about. So, you typically, in the early stages, you want to move quickly so that you can scope the problem and start getting data, but you also need to move quickly to acknowledge the problem and start establishing an authoritative voice on the issue. Now, when we're talking about a situation in the early stages, remember when I said the answer to what we know is typically, we don't know. Mm-hmm. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations will respond to that reality by not saying anything. Mm. Let me be very simple and clear. Don't do that, because if you don't say anything, what you're doing is you're creating an information vacuum. And if you don't fill that vacuum, someone or someone's else quite happily will. And typically those will be entities, people, organizations that have a completely different agenda than you do. And typically that agenda will often involve trying to use your situation as a platform for their own benefit. So, you do not want to create an information gap as much as possible. So, it's okay to go out and say, hey, we have reports that something is happening. We are investigating, and we'll let you know as soon as we have something. That's perfectly fine. Reporters will of course press for more information. Customers will of course press for more information, but at that stage you don't have it. But that's okay, because you're going out and trying to establish yourself as the authoritative source on your incident. And that is absolutely critical. I refer to this as walking out and grabbing the microphone. You want to grab the microphone and hold on to it as much as possible throughout the life of the incident.
So are there things that companies can do to prepare for this type of crisis communication?
Yes. So a couple of things that you can do is, first of all, build a process. And by process, I mean both a technical response process and a communications response process. Build a process, exercise the process. You will not find out how the process does not work until it's actually tested. And when I say test, I mean really test, and do drills, do tabletop exercises, do tests, and inject some reality into them. So for instance, you're doing a tabletop exercise that you've constructed for a data breach, and in your scenario, walk over, tap the head of communications on the shoulder and say, guess what? you're out of this exercise because you decided to go skiing in Vail, Colorado when this happened, and you're on a mountain and your cell phone doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, inject chaos, throw sand in the gears, because chaos and sand will get thrown in the gears when there's a real incident.
Yep.
Another key thing is from a communications point of view, you know, establish your roster of credible spokespeople who have been trained, build templates as much as possible, and have streamlined and expedited approval processes. So one key thing that I've seen organizations that are not mature do is they commingle the technical response and the communications response. They put up one big war room phone bridge with about 487 people on it, about 3/4 of which are executives, and they collectively work the issue. Now, when organizations do this, they do it because they're taking the incident seriously. That's great. You know, that is certainly better than organizations deciding to pretend nothing's happening. But having that many people on a call with no clear leadership is a sure way to inject analysis paralysis into everything. Also, you know, like I said, the needs of the communication side and the needs of the technical side are different needs. And continually commingling them on one bridge does neither track a service. Right. So having things built up in terms of a process, streamlining, templatizing, that's all good. Another thing I want to come back to is, if you build a process, start talking about that. If you build a process, you know, before there's an incident, you know, don't publicize it hugely, but do what you can to make sure that the world knows that you have a process. And an easy input point to this is to just start talking on your webpage, you know, about how people can report security and privacy issues. The benefit of establishing that you have a process is, let's go back to those early times of an incident. When you don't know anything, you can say, you know, that we're aware of this, we're looking into it. In addition to, we'll let you know as we know more, you can inject a fourth point just before that says, and we've got a process, we've activated that process, and that process is working it. You know, time and again, I have found being able to say, we have a process and we're working this through the process will give you more time and greater credibility, because people understand sometimes that processes take time. And that works to kind of balance out, because people want to know information now. But if you say we have a process, that helps balance by indicating that, you know, we're not going to have information right at this moment, but we do have a clue. We do have something that is being used in this. And, you know, hopefully you don't have to do this a lot. You know, obviously I worked for a company that did. If you have enough of these incidents and you keep coming back and saying, we have a process, that becomes self-reinforcing, self-referential, and builds further credibility. That credibility translates into more breathing room and more time, so that over here, you know, when you're working the technical issue, you've got more time to figure it out.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It seems like when we're dealing with security incident response, a lot of time we are focusing on the technical side, and forgot about the communication side. So we're practicing the technical side, but not practicing the communication side. So yeah, that's a great point that you brought up. In terms of the templates you mentioned, what are some examples?
So an example would be, actually, I just, you know, as we're talking, I gave one, which is we're aware of reports, we're investigating, we've got a process. We'll let you know as soon as we know anything. So, you know, 4 points. Those 4 points will pretty much never change in the first minutes of an incident. And And so you can take and templatize those and, get the appropriate approvals with your legal department, with executives, and basically just have them at hand, so that as soon as there's a report that something might be happening, boom, you've got it. One thing that I think people on the technical side of the house don't understand is how fast moving the PR side of the house is. The PR side of the house is always fast moving. If you take more than an hour on a regular response, you're too slow. And when we're talking about an incident, if you don't have something, boom, right then and there, when you get an inquiry, then you run the risk of seeing a story post that says, organization such and such was reported to be breached today. No one was available for immediate comment.
Oh, right.
That's you don't want that to happen. You can always do follow up and get your statement in afterwards, but that first posting is going to take off, and and if you are not in that first posting, you're going to be playing catch up. And coming back to the whole grabbing the mic thing, you want to be there in control of the message from the beginning.
Right. Is there some things that should or should not say in communication?
So things to say. First and foremost, showing, for lack of a better way of putting it, showing awareness and competence, very important. That's why going out and saying, we're aware of this. If you've got a process, saying, we're aware of this, we have a process, we've activated it, that does a couple things. That shows that you're not caught flat-footed, that you know what's happening, and you're doing something about it. Some key things to not say is you don't want to, on the communication side, to get ahead of what's happening on the technical side. And what I mean by that is you don't want to say things that may end up being incorrect or having to be revised. So being, some degree of being conservative as they're worked out on the technical side, being conservative on the communication side is important. You don't, for instance, you don't want to go out and say, oh, only 5 records were lost. And then the technical teams come back in 3 hours and say, oh yeah, sorry, did we say 5? We meant 5 million. Because if you've said 5 and then you have to say 5 million, let's go back to what we were talking about, that impacts your credibility. I have a saying where I say, you want to be as specific as possible, but not box yourself in. Or as I've put it, you want to be specifically vague. So, you don't want to hang your hat on pieces of technical information that we on the technical side know could be subject to change as the investigation progresses. I've done forensics, we're technical people. We both know that what in the first hour of an incident is not comprehensive. The first hour you're able to assess maybe the initial intrusion, and it's going to take 2 or 3 days before you figure out on the technical side, oh yeah, that they tipped over this server and got 5 records, and oh look, they used Mimikatz and they hit the AD. The AD, and they got all the AD data.
Right. Yep.
So, being upfront, disclosing as much as you can, but also ensuring that you're not getting ahead of the technical side such that you have to backtrack is important. In terms of what you should say, this is again where it's important to differentiate between security and privacy, because while in the United States and many countries there's no mandate as far as what you have to disclose around security incidents, there are very strict mandates and requirements around what you have to disclose around privacy incidents, whether we're talking GDPR in Europe or CCPA in California.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a data privacy incident, then what you say is going to be governed in part by disclosure laws.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I can tell you that immediately differentiates a security and a privacy incident. If it's a privacy incident, the lawyers come in immediately,
Right.
and one of the lawyers' first questions are the data that we believe was lost. Where did the people that this data is tied to reside?
Mm-hmm.
Because unfortunately, in the United States, we don't have comprehensive breach notification laws, which means that your notifications are going to be conditioned on which of the 50 states in the U.S. people might reside in. Just on a side note, and people with a privacy background, I think, will understand this. A few years ago, when dealing with privacy incidents, one of the first questions that would come from the lawyers would be, does anyone live in North Dakota?
Mm.
Because North Dakota has some surprisingly strict data breach notification laws. This was before CCPA,
I see.
but does anyone, is there anyone in North Dakota would be one of the first questions. So, bringing the lawyers in for a privacy incident also means that the lawyers are going to take a more active interest in the communications. Now, that's good because, we are talking about regulatory and legal requirements and liabilities. But I will say that as a communications person around privacy incidents, my needs and their needs are often at counter purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Because on my side, going out, disclosing as much as you can, being authoritative as much as possible means, going out and talking. And with respect, most attorneys, especially those involved in incidents, their first instinct is going to be say as little as possible. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a kind of a push-pull there.
Right.
And so you should prepare for that. But it's a bridgeable thing, but it is a reality.
Oh, yeah. And in the event of the crisis, security incident, who should talk to the press? Just curious.
First and foremost, you want someone that's trained. Mm-hmm. I joke that I have been combat PR trained.
That's good.
Because you can't, let's go back to what I was saying. You can't unring a bell. If you misspeak, you can't undo that. I've joked with people that I have seen people fired for saying the wrong thing to the press. I mean, that's the reality. And so I've said to people that are not press trained, who would sometimes want to talk to the press, I would say, why do you want to do this? You're not, you don't get hazard pay to do this.
They are.
Having people that are trained is important. And another key thing is having people that have credibility with the reporters is important. Mm-hmm. And this is where having someone who has a good technical background but is communications trained can be really good, because when we're talking about dealing with reporters that cover security incidents and cover privacy incidents as their day-to-day stuff, they know when they're talking with a PR person that has no background in it, and that has a direct impact on their receptivity and their credibility to the message that you're giving. So having someone on the front line that is talking with the reporters that actually understands what they're talking about, that understands the situation and what they know and can speak to it honestly and credibly is absolutely important. Another piece to this answer is having, on the PR side, we talk about having a roster of spokespeople and having kind of an escalation path in terms of who's going to speak to something. Having someone who can handle the day-to-day stuff and build that credibility is important, but sometimes if you have a very serious incident as an organization, you want to show that you're taking that seriously by having someone more senior come in. Now, the things that I've said around having credibility still pertain. You still want someone that can speak credibly to it, but moving from communications program manager to director, senior director indicates that that as an organization you're viewing this as more serious. Now, a couple of tricks to this is you don't want to over respond. You don't want the CEO coming out on every time something happens, because one of the key principles that I've said with things like this is you want to de-emergencyify response as much as possible. The reality is a big city has multiple emergencies that require the fire department to go out every day. The mayor of the city does not go out every day and say, we sent fire trucks to a medical emergency. We sent fire trucks to a car fire. We sent fire trucks. That just doesn't happen. The fire department has their public information officer. You want the same thing. Carrying that forward, when there's a major event, the mayor comes out and speaks. And they do that to indicate the gravity of the situation and to give more oomph to the message. You want to be able to do the same thing. Right. So having a roster, typically, and this goes back to the point about preparation, having a roster that's typically 3 levels deep is a good thing. You have the person that deals with this day to day, you have someone that can escalate to 1 level, and then you've got the mayor or the president basically that comes out for the once in a lifetime bad thing.
Right. And how about in dealing with a serious incident, is there a difference between the large and versus like a medium or smaller companies? Or what can you talk about that?
Sure. So it's funny. It ends up being a bit of a wash in terms of the differences. So large companies have benefits in terms of more resources, more training.
Yep.
But with that comes more layers of bureaucracy, more layers of ossification, and potential lower responses. You can't, going back to my example, you can't have 487 people on a phone bridge if you don't have 487 people.
Right.
So smaller organizations have the benefit of being smaller. They can move quickly, and they can and be more nimble, but they have less specialized expertise, and there can be real issues around resourcing because you've got small staff, everyone is doing pretty much every job, so that creates a challenge in that regard. So it ends up being a bit of a wash. There are advantages and disadvantages to both sides. Let's be clear, the disadvantages are mitigatable. If you're a large organization, just because you're a large organization doesn't mean that you can't build a process that is hyper streamlined. And I've helped build those processes. The key thing with that is, you build teams up that are empowered to make decisions, and you keep those teams absolutely narrow. Just because someone has the title of vice president doesn't mean they get to be on that phone bridge.
Right.
For smaller organizations, you cross train, you can build up a pool of consultants or vendors that you can pull in on an as needed basis. One key difference though is, if you're a large organization, let's use some security terminology here, you have a greater attack surface. People people are going to be more interested, from an adversarial point of view. They're going to be more interested in a larger company because, well, it's bigger publicity, and odds are good that as a large company, you've got more data and information that attackers might be interested in. There's also when you're dealing in crisis management, you're not just dealing in facts, you're dealing in expectations.
Right.
If you're a large company that is having a security incident, like a certain company I used to work for that I mentioned, there's going to be an expectation that, well, you've got nearly 100,000 employees, right? And you've got a security incident going on. So I expect that you've got 100,000 people working on this issue right now. Now, we all know that's not the case, but that's how people kind of think. If you're a smaller company, you're going to have more leeway. People understand that you're smaller and don't have a small, the population of a small nation and a budget that outstrips those of many nations to throw at the problem.
So if they don't have a PR person, they are trained, they probably can talk to somebody like you or some of the PR company.
Yeah, no, they could talk to me. They could talk, I'm always happy to help. They can talk with, if they've got a PR agency that they're working with. Many PR agencies do have crisis management as an offering. So here's one thing I will say, and that is, first of all, crisis communications is different from mainline PR. I always say it's through the looking glass, and everything that is right in the mainline PR world is wrong in my world, and vice versa. I will also say that security and privacy crisis communications has some key subtle differences from general crisis communications. The principles are the same. It's still through the looking glass compared to mainline PR, but talking security and privacy compared to product recalls or airplanes or things like that, there are some nuances that are really key, not least of which is many times, and as security people, we know this, many times when you're talking about security incidents in particular, you're dealing with a situation where there is an active opponent and adversary on the other side.
Yep.
It's and that puts wrinkles in that are important to be aware of. Another piece is when we're talking about security and privacy, we have a community of researchers, of experts that can provide commentary and assistance in ways that other industries and fields don't have to deal with.
Right.
Having good relationships with the research world when we're talking about a security incident can be of immeasurable benefit in terms of credibility. So let me go back to say, remember I said that having a process that's been exercised is a good thing. If you've got a group of security researchers that have worked with you and with that process and can independently say, this is bad, they're kind of idiots for this problem happening, but they've got a solid process and I have absolute confidence in that process. That buys you credibility and breathing room that you cannot pay for. Oh
yeah, it's definitely all about restoring the credibility, the trust. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us a bottle-tested experience here. Yeah, I think there's a lot of
my pleasure.
A lot of really nice thoughts. How should people contact you? How would they be able to find you?
Oh, easy. They can go to ChristopherBudd.com. That's Christopher like it's normally spelled, Budd, BUDD.com, and I've got contact information there. It's a very innovative and creative domain name.
No, that's good. Yeah. Hey, thank you. Really.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And so you know how to find Christopher, and let's talk again sometimes in the future.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.